The Gospel of Mark contains three passion and resurrection predictions. These are in chapter 8, verse 31, chapter 9, verse 31, and chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. A passion and resurrection prediction is when Jesus talks in advance about the fact that he must suffer, die, be buried, and rise again. There is not a single passion and resurrection prediction in which Jesus does not, after talking about his death on a cross, does not also in the same breath talk about his resurrection. It is only in the Gospel of Mark that all these three predictions are on the way. This fact illustrates that Mark intends readers of his Gospel to realize not merely that Jesus spoke these predictions while on the road and traveling with his disciples, but also, and more importantly, that Jesus was speaking about his way of life. And the way of life which anyone who wants to follow Jesus will also have. After each of these passion and resurrection predictions, there is a misunderstanding on the part of the closest of Jesus' followers, his disciples. After the first passion and resurrection prediction, Peter misunderstands when he does not want Jesus to go to the cross. Jesus corrects this misunderstanding by calling Peter and anyone who wants to follow him to deny themselves before taking up the cross. This is an important point to understand about how Jesus has placed what we must do. Jesus does not ask us to take our cross before we deny ourselves. If we do that, there is the likelihood that the cross might seem heavy because the self will come to the fore, because the self will be important, because we will be concerned about ourselves. This is why, before taking up the cross, Jesus tells his followers and anyone who would dare to follow him that they must deny themselves first. After the second passion and resurrection prediction, all the disciples misunderstand, because even after Jesus talks about it, when they are on the same way, they are discussing who is the greatest and who is first. Once again, Jesus has to explain to them that the first must be willing to be slave and servant of all. That if they want to be first, they must be willing to lay down their lives for others. If they want to be the greatest, they must be willing to be the least. After the third passion and resurrection prediction, the brothers James and John, whom Jesus has been so close to, who he has taken with him when he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead, whom he has taken with him on the Mount of Transfiguration, these brothers come to Jesus with a request for places of honor. It might seem that the other 10 were not involved. That is not true. The other 10 were as guilty of seeking places of honor as were James and John, because when they hear about this request of James and John, they are indignant against the brothers. Once again, Jesus calls all of them and explains that he has come not to be served, but to serve. This explanation is done not only in words, as both the first and the second reading of today point out, but through inconceivable and mind-boggling action on the part of Jesus. The first reading from the prophet Isaiah is part of the fourth and final servant song that is contained in the book of Isaiah. The suffering of the servant is a definite part of God's incomprehensible and unfathomable plan. It is the servant who will show through his life what true love, what true service really means. Appointed by God, he will use his power not to condemn, not to push down, but to save. He will bring to completion the fruition of the plan of God to save people everywhere and for all time. This is the theme that Jesus takes up in his instruction to the disciples in the gospel text of today. His task in the world, like that of the suffering servant whom Isaiah had prophesied about, was to become ransom for all, was to save through his own giving of his life. This he would do not by being served, but by reaching out in service. If the disciples wanted to follow him as fully as they ought to follow him, they also had to realize that wanting to be first meant willingness to be last. They had to realize that if they wanted to be master and Lord, it meant being slave and servant of all. Jesus showed them how to do this through his willingness to embrace the cross, even if it meant a scandal to those who did not believe, and even if in the eyes of others it was foolishness. He was willing to embrace the cross, even if it meant the end of his life known here on earth. He was willing to embrace the cross, even if it meant that he would be abandoned by all and seemingly even abandoned by God, his Father, when he cried out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And this is why the second reading from the book of Hebrews explains as confidently as it does that we as believers need have no fear. We have before us a model that we can imitate. This model is not a heavenly model. This model is not a clay model. This model is a totally human model like us in every single way, like us, to the point of being tested as we are, and the test, especially during these days of the pandemic. Jesus does not show us this way by directing us. He does not show us this way by giving us pointers. He shows us this way by asking us to look at him so that we can be inspired. And we need to ask ourselves whether we will imitate this way. If Jesus is able to understand our weakness, if Jesus is able to understand our frustration, our anxiety, our feeling of abandonment at this time in our lives, it is because he himself has gone through every single emotion. While on the one hand, we may be too quick to judge and even condemn the disciples for their striving, any attempt to practice detachment ourselves indicates how difficult it can be. We often experience feelings of jealousy, envy, resentment, antipathy, and hostility towards those who have more than we are and who are what we consider in a better position than we are. Even now, we keep craving for things, believing mistakenly that they will satisfy. Jesus shows us in the gospel text of today what it means to be a true disciple. He challenges us to give up our need to acquire and to take on more, the need to have more, instead to develop, adopt the attitude of detachment. He has shown us that in giving, we receive. In denying ourselves, that we find ourselves, and that detachment is possible. He tells us that he has gone through the challenges and the frustration that we are possibly going through now, and is inviting us to rise above it. He's inviting us to believe that even when we cannot experience it as tangibly as we would want to, God still loves. He's telling us that it is likely we are not finding these days the answers that we need to the questions that we. The answers, Jesus said, through his life will indeed come. We have only to keep searching and seeking for them. He's telling us that the confusion of our lives will be clarified if we persevere like him, if we do not give up. Even if it seems at this moment that the crosses we bear are like foolishness to those who can rationalize, and like a scandal to those who believe, we need to persevere. We need to believe that Jesus has gone through it, and that like him, if we also go through it, we will indeed conquer. Are we willing to deny ourselves so that we might carry this cross courageously